Hello and welcome to First Look, a Bible study looking ahead to the readings for the coming Sunday. My name's Carl and it's good to have you with us. This week we're going to be thinking about Jesus beginning his public ministry in Galilee and the authority and power that he displayed. But before we get cracking on that, you might like to download the sheet that accompanies this study. If you're watching on YouTube, you'll find the link just below the video. On the sheet, you'll find the text of our reading, places to make your own notes, the questions that we'll be thinking about later on, and some other passages that you might find helpful to look up. So without further ado, let's dive into our text, which this week is Mark chapter 1, verses 21 to 28. We're in the town of Capernaum in Galilee, which was a small fishing town, had a population apparently of about 1,500 people. So I suppose we might think of it today as a village, as much as the Bible describes these sorts of places as cities. It was the location, it seems, of Jesus' home synagogue. And if you recall in Luke's Gospel in chapter 4, Jesus stands up in the same synagogue and gives his manifesto. So it's an important place in the story of Jesus. And he stood up to teach on the Sabbath. This was something that any suitably qualified Jewish man was entitled to do. But as events unfolded, it proved to be no ordinary standing up on the Sabbath. Now, the key characters that we have here are an unidentified man who was possessed with an unclean spirit, and we hear that the said spirit identifies and challenges Jesus. And we also have the crowd who seem to behave as a unit. They're described to us as responding in the same way, a bit like crowds would respond in Greek tragedies, and that perhaps reflects something of the origins of Mark's Gospel. It was the first to be written, we know that, between the years 65 and 70, quite probably. So while the Judean revolt was going on, and before Rome destroyed Jerusalem and in particular the temple. So in other words, this is a story that comes from tempestuous times. If we're going to make sense of it, it's helpful to keep in mind the story from Genesis 32, verses 27 to 29, of Jacob wrestling with a mysterious divine figure. If you recall, in that story, Jacob demands to know the name of the person who's been wrestling with him, and he's denied that. And that's to do with the power of naming as it was understood in that culture. If you had someone's name, you had a kind of power over them. And it's like the divine figure refuses to give Jacob that power. I think there's something of that going on with the way the Spirit reacts to Jesus, and I'll say more about that as we go through. So we've ended up in Capernaum because Jesus had been travelling round the shore of the Sea of Galilee and proclaiming that the kingdom of God had come near. He's called his first disciples. In this gospel, they're Simon, as he was known at that point, and Andrew, and James and John. And now he's standing up in the synagogue to preach, as he'd done presumably many, many times before. Now, the use of the Greek word didisken, I think I pronounced that correctly, in verse 21, which is translated as he taught, is in the imperfect tense, and that indeed implies a repeated pattern of activity. What Mark is giving us here, I think, is therefore a typical Sabbath episode when Jesus was in Capernaum. His style of preaching, of teaching, was very different to the priests and the scribes. They would very much build on the authority of those who had gone before them. So as they were teaching, they would say things like, Moses said this, or Rabbi so-and-so taught that. Jesus seems to have had quite a different style. As Tom Wright puts it, he had a quiet but compelling authority all of his own. And we see that in verse 22. What I think comes across in the way that Mark deals with this episode is the way that Jesus' words and actions are linked. They have an integrity, they are bound together. And this is the first of 4 exorcisms that will be depicted in Mark's Gospel. The others are in chapter 5, verses 1 to 20, chapter 7, in verses 24 to 30, and in chapter 9, in verses 14 to 29. The emphasis in this story is very much on Jesus' actions. And indeed, it's interesting to note that we're not told what Jesus actually said that day as he taught. We do know, however, that his hearers were amazed. All seems to be going well, therefore, but into the scene bursts a man who has been taken over by an unclean spirit. When it talks about unclean here, it means a spirit that was opposed to God, that was unholy. And these destructive powers, however we understand that have taken over this man's life, seem to have a kind of inside track on who Jesus is. And they know what he's about. They say, we know that you're Jesus of Nazareth, and we know that you are the Holy One of Israel. In other words, we know that you are the Messiah. And so they know that he's about trying to set people free from all that oppressed them, free from all that distanced them from God. And this is true of individuals and of the nations alike. We need to keep in mind as we read this text, which I think can be quite a difficult one for modern hearers, that the way the world was understood in that day was quite different to how we've perhaps come to view it within our Western scientific rationalist worldview. People in that day and age understood the world to be full of spirits, some good, some evil. Indeed, many other cultures around the world today share that kind of understanding of things. And it seems that Jesus was very much a product of his time in this. He was shaped by that worldview. We might talk about somebody having a particular medical condition, or somebody having to overcome their personal demons. I don't want to get too bogged down in that, but I think it is helpful to note that there was that different worldview, and being able to perform an exorcism was seen as showing that one had authority from God in that context, in that understanding of what was going on here. It's a sign also of a bigger canvas, a bigger picture, of arguably something like an apocalyptic struggle as the kingdom of God breaks in through the person of Jesus and sets people free, brings healing, brings hope. The expression, "what have you got to do with us?" is a Hebrew expression, an Old Testament expression that was often used in contexts of dispute, trying to place the responsibility for what then happened on the adversary. And we see examples of that in Judges 11 verse 12 and 1 Kings chapter 17 verse 18. So it seems that what's going on here is the Spirit is confronting Jesus with words that say, you're responsible for what happens thereafter. When the Spirit makes those identifications of Jesus, his name and his origin from Nazareth, and being the Holy One of Israel, the Messiah, that takes us back to the story of Jacob wrestling with God. And it was about much more than just identification. It's continuing this adversarial tone, and it's trying to gain an advantage over Jesus, trying to exert a power over him. We might think in the story of Genesis 2 of Adam naming the creatures and having that power. It's like this unclean spirit is trying to do the same thing. On other occasions, Jesus will be identified by demons as the Son of God in chapter 3 verse 11 and as Son of the Most High God in chapter 5 verse 7. As on all those occasions, he responds, as we see in verse 25 of today's passage, by rebuking or overpowering or exorcising those spirits, depending on how we translate the Greek. The convulsions that this poor man experiences in verse 26 were a feature of many of these healings, serving, as some commentaries argue, to add drama and tension to what's going on. I think it's really interesting that the man is not named, so presumably wasn't known to the early church, and doesn't actually kind of really feature in the story in his own right. He's more of a vehicle for what's happening. And I think that's because Mark's emphasis is primarily on Jesus's authority and how that comes out through his words and particularly through his actions. His authoritative healings seem to be one of the main reasons that his fame spreads and he becomes popular quite quickly, as we learn about in verse 28. And the huge crowds that he attracted as a result of these healings made him appear dangerous and threatening to the religious authorities, to those very people who taught in a very different way to how Jesus did. We're told that people were amazed at what Jesus did with this act of healing. I wonder, though, if they were sort of, wow, or if they were, isn't this amazing? Or if actually they were quite scared by what they saw. We're told that they were wondering, who is this? How did he do that? And the Greek word that's used in Mark 10, which is the same word that's used here, which is, I think, pronounced phabeomai, points to perplexity and bewilderment and shock. So this isn't necessarily a celebratory amazement, but it is an amazement that makes people take Jesus seriously. They recognize his authority and power. As I say here, the authority of his words that we see in verse 22 is matched by the authority of his actions in verse 27. There's already here a looking towards the cross. Jesus' authority and power would not lead to self-aggrandizement. He was not a kind of Vladimir Putin or Donald Trump style figure who wants to kind of grasp that power for his own gain and hold on to it as tightly as possible. Instead, we know that Jesus would pay the ultimate price for challenging those destructive forces at work in our world that entrap people, whether those forces were religious or secular. And that's at the heart of this passage, I think. Jesus is doing this because it comes from a place of self-giving love. And I think that is the source and the heart of Jesus' authority and power.